Snow drifts sideways over the Neva like torn pages from a book that won't stop closing. Street lamps hiss. A distant bell counts a cold hour, then another, and then the city holds its breath. A soldier warms numb fingers against the barrel of his rifle. A mother presses her child deeper into a shawl as wind sneaks through every stitch. Windows glow with amber light in the winter palace, but the glass trembles as if it knows what the night will bring. In that thin space between silence and shouting, a dynasty stands at the window, watching its own reflection in the dark river, 3 centuries of crowns reflected by water black as ink, ready to swallow it all. A door somewhere opens. A whisper. A footstep. The Romanovs are about to meet their winter. The wind moved through the forest like an ancient breath. Pines whispered in long sighs, their needles dusted in frost. Beyond them, a small monastery crouched against the cold, its domes dull with soot, its bells mute under snow. Inside, a boy was praying, his voice a thread of sound, trembling, uncertain. Mikhail Romanov was 16. His hands were raw from winter, his eyes dark and watchful. Behind him, the walls were painted with saints who seemed to lean closer with every whisper of his prayer. Outside, sleighs arrived, the sound of hooves crunching ice, the creak of wheels cutting through crusted snow. Men in furs and armor dismounted, faces pale and drawn, carrying not weapons but exhaustion. These were messengers of a broken land. Russia had been without peace for years, famine, impostors, invaders. Whole villages had burned for bread. The throne in Moscow sat empty, haunted by ghosts of false czars. And now, in this cold monastery, they sought a boy who did not want a crown. The door opened, spilling white light and frozen air. "Mikhail Fyodorovich," a voice said, echoing through the chapel. "By the will of God and the people, you are chosen." The boy lifted his head slowly. The words hung in the cold like smoke. His mother, Martha, stepped forward, her face carved by grief. "He is too young," she said softly. "He has known only prayer, not power. Have you not seen what thrones do to those who sit upon them?" But the men only bowed lower. "Russia has no father," they said, "and no son will live without one." Mikhail looked at the floor. He could smell wax and pine resin, hear the wind scratching the walls like fingernails. "Why me?" he asked. No one answered. Only the bells began to ring, slow, heavy, each toll a heartbeat of a dying nation. He rose, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. His steps were hesitant, his shadow long. The bells did not stop. Somewhere far away, in Moscow's frozen streets, people began to pray again, whispering his name like the promise of dawn after too long a night. A boy had been chosen to save a country that had forgotten how to be whole. The road to Moscow was a frozen wound through the heart of Russia. Sleighs creaked over the ruts, horses snorted plumes of steam, and the boy who would be czar sat wrapped in fur too large for his narrow shoulders. Peasants knelt as he passed, crossing themselves not in joy but in disbelief, as though daring to hope again might summon another disaster. Behind every tree memory lingered, soldiers buried in snow, fields stripped bare, mothers clutching their last child. The time of troubles had been more than war. It had been hunger dressed as fate. Mikhail Romanov's mother rode beside him, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. "They will tear you apart," she whispered once, her voice almost lost to the wind. "You will wear the crown of your father's ruin." But Mikhail only stared at the horizon, where smoke marked villages trying to wake from despair. "If I refuse," he murmured, "there will be no Russia left to bury me." When they reached the Kremlin, bells began to toll again, this time not for death but for beginning. Inside the cathedral, candles leaned in waves of trembling light. The patriarch's voice echoed from stone. "By the mercy of God, we crown thee, Mikhail Fyodorovich, Tsar of all the Russias." The crown, heavy, ancient, rimmed with frost and gems, settled on the boy's brow. It was too large. He flinched as its weight bit into his scalp. Somewhere beyond the gates, wolves howled not from hunger but recognition. For years afterward, the young Tsar would rule with more silence than speech. Letters describe him as gentle, reluctant, like a candle in a storm. He rebuilt slowly, trade routes first, then fields, then trust. His signature was careful, as though afraid the ink itself might bleed rebellion. Yet the people followed. "Better a kind boy than a cruel ghost," they said in markets, and the Romanov name began to mean something other than grief. Still, each winter, Mikhail dreamed of the monastery, of bells tolling and doors opening to strangers. He knew even then that Russia's peace would always be built on thin ice. But for now, he kept the fire lit. A dynasty had begun, not with conquest or thunder, but with the soft sound of a boy's breath turning to frost in a cathedral's cold light. Years passed and the land began to breathe again. Smoke no longer rose from burnt villages but from the chimneys of rebuilt homes. Market bells clanged above the murmur of trade. In the wooden streets of Moscow, children played where soldiers once bled. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. And that, in Russia, was a kind of miracle. Tsar Mikhail's court remained humble. He avoided grandeur, favoring the sound of scripture over the chatter of courtiers. His robes were plain, his crown often left in its chest. To those who served him, he seemed less a ruler than a custodian, a caretaker tending the wounded soul of his nation. Yet even humility could not escape the weight of politics. Boyars whispered in candlelight, old factions reknit their threads, and each decision became a tug-of-war between mercy and necessity. In the long winters, Mikhail would walk the wooden corridors of the Kremlin, the air heavy with resin and the faint sweetness of beeswax. He would pause at windows to watch the snow drift like ash over the city. In his journal's modest, careful words, he wrote of his fear of pride, of the burden of inherited chaos. "The crown is cold," one line reads, "and the throne colder still." Yet he ruled with patience, choosing compromise over command. He rebuilt not as a conqueror but as a craftsman of peace. When he died in 1645, church bells tolled across a land that had known too many funerals. But these bells were different. They were not tolling for loss but for continuity. His son, Alexei, would take the throne, older, wiser, and more ambitious. Under him, the Romanov Dynasty would begin to taste true power. The seeds of empire stirred beneath the frost. And somewhere, beyond the forests of Kostroma, the monastery still stood. Candles still burned where the boy once prayed. The snow fell as it always had, slow, endless, forgiving, as if the land itself knew that this story had only just begun. The bells faded into silence, leaving behind an echo that would last for 300 years. Dawn broke over the shipyards like a sword drawn from its sheath. The river Neva lay under ice, but men were already hacking channels through it, their axes ringing like church bells for a new kind of faith in change. The smell of pine pitch and sweat mixed with the iron tang of frost. At the center of it all, tall and broad-shouldered, a man in a plain coat swung his hammer beside the laborers. His name was Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, though history would call him the Great. He was no ordinary ruler. He cursed, laughed, bled, and built with his own hands. He learned shipcraft from Dutch sailors, engineering from German artisans, anatomy from foreign surgeons. "Russia," he once said, "must break its old skin or perish within it." And so he began to tear. The Moscow of icons and incense became a forge. Beards were shorn, coats shortened, tongues forced to pronounce foreign words. 1,000 years of custom groaned under the weight of new ambition. Those who resisted felt the lash. Those who followed felt the fever of transformation. St. Petersburg, his window to the west, rose from swamp and mist, built on the bones of peasants and the dream of progress. "We are sinking," one worker wrote in a letter, "but the Tsar says it is the foundation of glory." Ships took shape under Peter's gaze, great hulks of oak that would drag Russia into the Baltic and beyond. Cannons gleamed like eyes beneath tarpaulins. Snow blew through half-finished walls, and yet the city grew, relentless, audacious. Peter paced its muddy streets in storm and sleet, shouting orders, drawing maps in the air. "I build not for today," he told a weary architect, "but for the centuries." But every hammer blow had its echo. In villages far from the Neva, peasants starved while nobles schemed to keep their power under the mask of reform. Monasteries whispered prayers for a vanished world. The wind that filled Peter's sails carried both promise and mourning, the strange scent of empire being born. Still, the Tsar pressed on. He named his city after his saint, but it was his reflection he saw shimmering in the ice, vast, unyielding, and coldly beautiful. After Peter's thunder faded into memory, the empire he'd built stood vast but trembling, a giant unsure of its reflection. Into that echo stepped a woman whose voice would outlast the roar of his cannons. Catherine Alexeyevna, born far from Russia, came not as a conqueror, but as an idea that learned to wear a crown. The courtiers called her Catherine the Great. The poets called her the enlightened empress. She called herself simply a student of reason. The court was a gallery of gold and suspicion. Mirrors multiplied chandeliers into endless constellations, and silk whispered along marble floors. But Herring preferred the scratch of a quill to the rustle of gowns. Each night she wrote letters to Voltaire, to Diderot, to philosophers who dreamed that thought itself could change the world. A ruler, she said, must love wisdom as much as power. And so, while armies marched on distant plains, she built schools, hospitals, and theaters. She gathered painters and astronomers, cartographers and poets. The empire learned to read. Yet every light casts a shadow. Beyond her palaces stretched a land still shackled by serfdom. Peasants bent their backs in fields they would never own. Taxes crushed whole villages into silence. When rebellion rose under Pugachev, the man who claimed to be her dead husband returned. Fire swept across the steppe. Catherine crushed it swiftly, ruthlessly. Enlightenment, it seemed, had no patience for chaos. Still she dreamed of harmony, a Russia both powerful and educated, modern and eternal. She expanded the empire across continents, her signature trailing across treaties like a comet's tail. In portraits, she sits astride a horse, gaze fixed forward, unflinching. Around her, maps grew fat with conquest. "I am married to Russia," she once said, "and that marriage will never end." By the time she died in 1796, the empire she had shaped stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from Europe to the edge of China. Her courtiers wept, but the peasants merely bowed their heads and continued to reap. The snow fell again, soft, endless, and indifferent. The hammers had built, and the light had spread. But under the glittering ice of progress, the old cracks were waiting. When Catherine's heart stopped, the empire exhaled not in relief, but in awe of its own immensity. It stretched now across 11 time zones, stitched together by conquest, ambition, and exhaustion. The courtiers whispered of her intellect. The peasants remembered only her taxes. Yet even her critics knew she had turned Russia into a continent that thought of itself as a world. In the years that followed, her heirs tried to wear her crown, but found it heavier than gold. Palaces multiplied like reflections in a mirror, each grander, emptier than the last. Marble staircases led to rooms filled with silence and portraits of rulers who stared down eternity. The Romanovs had learned how to build, but not how to rest. Beyond the palaces, the land endured its endless rhythm: spring mud, summer toil, autumn smoke, winter starvation. The nobles danced, the peasants endured. The empire glittered like frost, sharp and cold. "Russia," one French visitor wrote, "is not ruled, it is survived." Yet within this iron garden, new seeds stirred. A generation of thinkers began to question the order beneath the beauty. Decembrists, poets, reformers, they carried Catherine's fire but turned it against her heirs. They spoke of freedom in a land that had never known it. Their words, forbidden and fragile, drifted through taverns and salons like sparks over dry fields. For now, the dynasty still stood, proud, jeweled, and unbroken. But from the shipyards Peter had built to the salons Catherine had gilded, a question was beginning to hum beneath the snow. How long can a throne rest on silence? The bells of St. Petersburg rang again, bright and distant. The empire had become a vast mirror, and in its reflection the first cracks were forming. Morning light slid through the tall windows of the Winter Palace, gilding every surface it touched: crystal, marble, silk, gold. The Romanov Dynasty had learned to live inside light, to reflect it, to bend it into power. But behind the mirrors, the air was colder. Beneath the polished floorboards, the echo of marching boots could already be heard. In 1812, Napoleon's army crossed the Niemen River. Europe held its breath. The invincible emperor of the West was marching eastward into a land of silence and snow. Tsar Alexander, I proud, devout, and haunted by his father's ghost, met destiny not with ceremony but with fire. As the French approached Moscow, the city burned itself. Flames consumed wooden streets. The sky turned red as a wound. "They leave us ashes," a soldier wrote, "but even ashes can choke the enemy." And they did. Winter arrived like a weapon. French drums fell silent beneath the blizzard's roar. The frozen dead marked the road back to Paris. Russia, wounded and hungry, had survived again. Yet victory carried a strange aftertaste. The empire was triumphant, but the people remained voiceless. The Tsar dreamed of peace, but his ministers whispered of order. The candles in the palace burned longer each night, as though to keep shadows from gathering. Alexander, now called the Blessed, withdrew from grandeur, walking barefoot in prayer. "We have conquered," he said once, "but not ourselves." When he died, the throne wavered between two brothers, Constantine and Nicholas. Confusion turned to conspiracy, and the first winds of rebellion stirred in the heart of the capital. On a December morning in 1825, soldiers filled Senate Square. They stood silent, rifles upright, snow gathering on their shoulders. "For Constantine and Constitution," they shouted, not understanding that neither would come. Nicholas I, the Iron Tsar, crushed them with cannon fire. The snow turned red. The echoes of freedom froze in place. From that day forward, Russia learned to whisper again. Nicholas I ruled like a man standing guard over a sleeping giant, knowing that if it ever woke, it might crush him. He filled the empire with censors, spies, and schools that taught obedience before literacy. Portraits of him hung in classrooms, churches, and taverns. His gaze followed the people even when he was nowhere near. He called it order. The poets called it fear. Yet even fear cannot keep silence forever. Beneath the chandeliers of St. Petersburg, a new generation whispered of Europe, of freedom, constitutions, and equality. The Decembrists, exiled to Siberia, wrote letters that crossed the snow like contraband prayers. In salons, noblewomen hid banned books behind lace curtains. And in candle-lit corners, a young poet named Pushkin wrote verses sharp enough to cut through censors' ink. His death, a duel, a bullet, a nation's gasp, became a symbol of what Russia devoured to protect itself. Meanwhile, the empire stretched outward again toward the Caucasus, the Black Sea, the far horizon. The map grew fat, but the heart hollowed. Factories sprouted like weeds, choking the air with soot. Steam engines screamed through fields where serfs still bent their backs to the soil. Progress came, but it came unevenly, like sunlight through broken glass. By the time Alexander II inherited the throne in 1855, the empire was an aging lion limping under its own weight. The Crimean War had bled it dry. Modern Europe had laughed at its rusted armies. "We cannot remain as we are," the Tsar admitted. "To preserve, we must change." And so, in 1861, he did what no Romanov before him had dared. He freed the serfs. The news spread like thunder across the countryside. Bells rang, peasants wept, and priests blessed the air. But freedom, when handed down instead of earned, is never simple. The newly liberated found themselves chained by debt, lost in a world that had changed its name but not its nature. "They call us free," one farmer wrote, "but we still bow our backs to the same earth." The Tsar became Alexander the Liberator, and also the most hunted man in Russia. Assassins waited in shadows. Revolution simmered under every prayer. As he signed reforms, conspirators built bombs. One cold March day in 1881, on a canal near the Winter Palace, an explosion split the air. Smoke, screams, blood on snow, the emperor lay dying in the street, his dream of reform blown open beside him. The silk had torn, and through the rip darkness began to seep. When the dust of the explosion that killed Alexander II settled, the snow was no longer white. In its stains lay the color of the century to come. His son, Alexander III, inherited the throne with the trembling hand of a man who had seen what mercy cost. He vowed there would be no more experiments with freedom. The empire, he declared, would return to faith, autocracy, and nation. He built statues instead of reforms. The air in St. Petersburg grew heavy with incense and iron. Police patrols thickened like fog. Students were arrested for reading, workers for speaking, peasants for dreaming. "Better a single whip than 1,000 daggers," the Tsar said, and the people bowed again, not from loyalty, but from habit. Yet beneath the stillness, something was moving. In cities swollen with smoke and factories, a new class began to stir. Men and women who had left the land and found wages instead of fields, hunger instead of hope. Among them spread pamphlets, whispers, names of exiled thinkers. One in particular, Vladimir Ulyanov, a young lawyer's son from Simbirsk, read of injustice and decided to make it his profession. He would later sign his words with a single name that would unmake the world: Lenin. In parlors, officers waltzed beneath chandeliers. In basements, workers met by candlelight, their faces half lit, half lost. A student's typewriter clattered through the night, spitting out forbidden words. "We are the living cracks in the marble," one wrote. "We are the ticking inside the clock." By 1894, Alexander III was dead, a sudden illness, a silent passing. His son Nicholas II was 26, unready and deeply afraid of his own throne. As the bells of coronation tolled, thousands of peasants gathered in Kodinka field to celebrate. Rumors spread that gifts were scarce, and the crowd surged. When the soldiers arrived, they found a meadow of bodies, trampled, broken, suffocated under the weight of hunger and hope. Nearly 1,400 dead, before the new Tsar had even spoken his first decree. That night the royal ball continued as planned. Music played, crystal glasses clinked. Somewhere outside the palace gates, a woman searched for her son's shoe in the mud. The century's clock had begun to tick louder. The year was 1896, and the empire glittered like crystal just before it shatters. The coronation of Nicholas II had been meant as a celebration, the dawn of a youthful ruler, the renewal of a dynasty. But beneath the gold-threaded banners, something darker stirred. The tragedy at Kodinka field, where thousands were crushed beneath their own hope, clung to the new Tsar like a curse whispered into his ear. "A bad omen," the people murmured, "for a gentle man in a ruthless world." Nicholas wrote that night in his diary with the calmness of habit. A great day, walked, dined, danced. The ink did not tremble, but history did. His world was one of contradictions, devotion and distance, prayer and fear. He loved his wife, Alexandra, with quiet ferocity. She, the German-born empress, carried her own shadows, isolation, frailty, and an unshakable belief that their rule was ordained by God. When their long-awaited son, Alexei, was born, their joy turned to dread. The boy's blood would not clot. Each bruise became a prophecy. In this private agony entered a man who smelled of incense and iron, Grigory Rasputin. A wandering mystic with the eyes of a storm, Rasputin claimed to still the child's bleeding with prayer. Whether it was faith or chance, Alexei survived the night, and the empire gained a new shadow. "He saved our son," Alexandra whispered. "He is God's man." But others saw something else, a charlatan with calloused hands on holy ground. Whispers crawled through the marble halls. Ministers winced, nobles gossiped, servants crossed themselves twice when he passed. Yet the more they spoke, the closer Alexandra drew him in. "Russia does not understand," she said, "but Russia will obey." Outside, factories belched smoke into the gray Petersburg sky. The hum of machines grew louder, the growl of hunger louder still. Workers spoke of wages and whips, students spoke of change. In the streets, pamphlets fluttered like black snow, printed in secret presses that beat like second hearts. The empire was no longer one voice. It was 1,000 arguing through the cold. And the Tsar, earnest, isolated, believing himself chosen, could not hear any of them. By the turn of the new century, the empire was a volcano buried under snow, quiet on the surface, seething beneath. The factories of Moscow and Petrograd worked without pause, forging metal and unrest. Strikes began like whispers, a missed wage here, a protest there. They swelled into marches, chants echoing between frozen walls. And then came the year 1905, the first tremor. It began with faith. On a gray January morning, Father Gapon, a priest with sorrow in his voice, led a procession through the streets toward the Winter Palace. They carried no rifles, only icons, petitions, and faith that the little father, their czar, would hear them. Families walked together, children clutching candles, the air smelling of wax and snow. "Do not be afraid," Gapon said. "He will listen, he must." But Nicholas did not come to the balcony. His soldiers did. Rifles cracked, candles fell. The hymn turned into screams as gunfire shredded the prayer in midair. When it was over, the snow was no longer white. Hundreds lay dead or dying, men, women, children, their blood freezing where it fell. Bloody Sunday, they called it, and the echo of those shots would never fade. That night Gapon wrote only one line in his notebook: "There is no czar." Nicholas was devastated yet uncomprehending. He prayed, he wept, but he did not change. In the same palace where his grandfather's blood had stained the cobblestones, he signed new decrees of silence. For every protest crushed, 10 more rose. The empire was learning to speak in the language of defiance. Then came war, first against Japan, a distant enemy the Tsar dismissed as weak. But the soldiers soon discovered modern weapons and disciplined tactics waiting for them in the Pacific fog. Russia's fleet was annihilated at Tsushima Strait. Her armies bled in Manchuria. "We are fighting the future," a general confessed, "and the future is winning." The people's faith cracked further. In taverns and alleys, songs turned to curses. In the countryside, villages burned again, not by invasion this time, but by revolt. Nicholas agreed to a parliament, the Duma, to calm the storm. But when it questioned him, he dissolved it. The walls of autocracy still stood, but frost had crept into every stone. At night in the imperial nursery, Alexandra knelt beside her son's bed, clutching the hem of his blanket. "He suffers," she whispered to Rasputin, who stood in the doorway like a shadow cast by candlelight. "Make him whole again." And the mystic prayed, his voice low and rhythmic, like the chant of some older Russia, one that still believed in miracles. Outside, the wind howled across the Neva. The empire held its bria. Unaware that its next exhalation would come in fire. The empire entered the Great War as if stepping into a storm already brewing. Banners waved, choirs sang, and trains rolled east with soldiers cheering beneath clouds of steam. "For Tsar and fatherland," they shouted, but few understood how deep the abyss before them ran. 1914 was a year of faith. By 1917, it would become a year of reckoning. At first, victory seemed near, but the front line stretched endlessly, swallowing millions. Shells fell like iron rain, frost and famine marched beside the army, letters from soldiers grew thin and bitter. "We are bones in the snow," one wrote, "and the snow does not care who wins." Families waited in silence as bread vanished from shops. Mothers traded wedding rings for flour. Fathers buried sons beneath frozen soil. Nicholas left the palace to command the army himself, a gesture of duty that became a sentence of doom. The moment he rode to the front, he left the empire's heart beating without rhythm. In Petrograd, Alexandra ruled in his stead, clinging to Rasputin as both healer and prophet. Ministers fell, rumors multiplied, and the air thickened with disbelief. "The empress listens only to the mad monk," whispered generals, and the word mad began to sound like truth. Then one night in December 1916, Rasputin's body was found under the ice of the Neva, poisoned, shot, beaten, drowned, and yet still feared. The people murmured that the empire had slain its own reflection. By winter's end, hunger ruled the capital. The soldiers Nicholas had trusted refused their orders. They joined the crowds demanding bread, peace, dignity. The Tsar returned to find his empire dissolving in front of him, banners torn, palaces emptied, loyalty evaporated like frost in sunlight. On March 2, 1917, in a train car stopped in a forest, Nicholas II signed his abdication. He pressed his pen so hard it tore the paper. "For the good of Russia," he wrote, and handed away 3 centuries of power. Outside, the snow fell soundlessly, as if the sky itself was erasing history. When the news reached Petrograd, church bells rang not in mourning, not in joy, but in confusion. A nation without a czar stood blinking in the pale light of an unfinished dawn. In Tobolsk, where the exiled family was later sent, Alexandra wrote in her diary, "The windows frost over every night. We draw hearts in the ice so we remember we are still alive." The Romanovs, now prisoners of their own crown, waited for spring. But in Russia, spring often comes with blood. Petrograd, 1917. The streets were rivers of slush and smoke, and the air was heavy with the smell of coal, sweat, and something older, the scent of history burning its bridges. The Romanovs had fallen. The double-headed eagle still hung over the palaces, but its wings were blackened with soot. Crowds surged through Nevsky Prospect carrying red banners stitched by trembling hands. 1,000 voices rose, not in harmony but in hunger. The provisional government took its place in the marble rooms the Tsar had vacated. Ministers argued under chandeliers still warm from imperial breath. They promised elections, bread, and peace, promises that vanished into the cold faster than the smoke from their cigars. The people had waited too long to wait again. Soldiers deserted the front, factory workers demanded control, and peasants seized the land they had plowed for others. The air vibrated with slogans: peace, land, bread. All power to the Soviets. Among the crowds walked a man returned from exile, his coat frayed, his eyes aflame, Vladimir Lenin. He spoke with the cadence of thunder wrapped in reason. "The time for petitions is over," he declared. "The time for power has come." His words spread faster than bullets, printed on scraps of paper and whispered in queues for bread. To some he was salvation, to others an omen, but everyone listened. In October, under a moon drowned in smoke, the Bolsheviks struck. The Winter Palace, once the heart of the Romanov world, trembled again, this time under the boots of soldiers wearing red stars instead of imperial crests. Inside, the provisional government waited behind locked doors. The thunder of the Aurora, a single cruiser anchored in the Neva, shattered the night. The revolution began not with a roar but with a single shot echoing through centuries. When the soldiers entered, they found half-eaten meals, open ledgers, and frightened ministers. The empire of the czars ended between ticking clocks and overturned chairs. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft as ash. Far from Petrograd's shouting streets, the Romanovs sat behind frosted windows in a small house in Tobolsk, their world reduced to a few rooms and the creak of snow-laden roofs. The former czar, once surrounded by generals and gold, now chopped wood with calloused hands. The empress mended clothes beside a sputtering lamp. Their daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, scrub bed floors that once would have been polished for them. They called it the governor's house, but it was a cell built of wood and memory. Each day unfolded with the rhythm of waiting, morning prayers, simple meals, letters written to no one who would answer. They listened to the river's ice groan at night and wondered which sound would come first, thaw or deliverance. Nicholas's diary entries shrank to fragments: walked, read, prayed. The words were bones picked clean by time. The guards changed often. Some showed kindness, sharing bread or brief conversation. Others spat the word Citizen Romanov with bitter satisfaction. But it was not cruelty that hurt most, it was erasure. The family who had ruled an empire was being slowly unwritten. Then came the order for transfer Ekaterinburg, deeper into the Ural Mountains. They were told it was temporary for their safety. The journey was long and wordless, their train sliding through an empire they no longer owned. From the windows they saw peasants tilling thawed soil, children chasing dogs, soldiers smoking in silence. No one saluted, no one bowed. Their new home was smaller still, the Ipatiev house, renamed by its guards the House of Special Purpose. Iron bars crossed the windows, guards' boots echoed on the stairs. The air smelled of damp wood and disinfectant. Alexandra kept a small icon near her bed. Nicholas read aloud from the Bible each night. God sees all, he told his daughters softly, and what he sees he remembers. Outside, Russia tore itself apart. The civil war raged between red and white, Bolshevik and loyalist, future and past. Villages burned, trains vanished, and the snow drank freely of blood. In Petrograd, Lenin wrote that the revolution must defend itself, and in Ekaterinburg, men interpreted those words with final precision. One evening, the family heard gunfire in the distance. It went on for hours, then stopped. The next day, the guards were quieter than usual. Anastasia whispered to her sister, "Do you think it's almost over?" Maria nodded. "Yes, one way or another." The ice on the river began to break. Night gathered early over Ekaterinburg. The lamps burned dim in the Ipatiev house, their glow flickering against walls that had heard too many whispers. Outside, the Ural wind keened through birch trees, cold and endless. Inside, the Romanov family prayed. It was July 16th, 1918, a date no one in that house would see end. Nicholas sat by the window, his hands clasped, face pale in the half-light. Alexandra wrote in her small, slanted hand. The children played cards, the weather warm, Alexei weak again. Her words, calm and mundane, were her defiance. Each line denied the fear that had become their final guest. At midnight, footsteps echoed on the stairs, boots on wood, measured, heavy. The guard captain appeared, his voice stiff with something that sounded like regret. "You must come downstairs," he said. "For your safety, the city is restless." The family rose quietly. Olga carried a pillow. Alexandra gathered her son in her arms. They descended into a basement lit by a single bulb, its hum louder than the silence. Nicholas looked around the small room, lined with whitewashed walls. "May we have chairs for the ladies?" he asked softly. Chairs were brought. The family waited. The air smelled of lime dust and gun oil. The door opened again. The captain's face had changed, no longer a mask of duty but of finality. "Your relatives have tried to rescue you," he said quickly. "But things have gone wrong. You are to be executed." For a moment no one moved. Then Nicholas turned toward his family and whispered, "What? What did he say?" The captain raised his pistol. The bulb trembled. Gunfire filled the room like a storm breaking through stone. When it ended, smoke hung in the air like mist. The house stood still, quiet again except for the drip of water or blood from the ceiling beams. The soldiers, pale and shaking, opened a window to let the night breathe. They left the bodies where they fell. Outside, dawn was already crawling over the horizon, gray and merciless. Somewhere beyond the city, a train whistled, the sound of history leaving the station. Days later, the remains were carried into the forest. The birches stood as witnesses while shallow graves were dug. The earth accepted the Romanovs without ceremony. No prayers, no crowns, only the wind. And yet in that silence, something endured, not glory, not empire, but the echo of a story that had begun with a frightened boy in Kostroma 3 centuries before. The dynasty that once ruled a continent had ended where it began. In snow, in faith, in the fragile breath between mercy and memory. The snow fell soft as ash. The empire of the czars was gone. But its ghost, its questions, its splendor, its sorrow, would haunt the century to come.